Good morning. The purpose of this hearing is to receive testimony from expert witnesses in the security realm that will educate our efforts to mitigate threats posed by the Chinese Communist Party to the U.S. homeland. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Well, good morning. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for testifying today, bringing your expertise to this committee and informing members of Congress about the threats that we're currently facing. Despite years of attempts by the United States to develop a productive, fair, and honest relationship with the People's Republic of China, America has been met with dishonesty and aggression. The PRC government run by the Chinese Communist Party has deceived and manipulated us at every turn, committing espionage in our homeland and working to overturn the global rules-based order. The U.S. is now locked in a peer competition with the CCP, in which the Chinese government is seeking to place itself at the top of the global world order while degrading America's power militarily, diplomatically, and economically. In recent months, events have shown us that the CCP has escalated this competition. On January 28th, a Chinese surveillance balloon entered U.S. airspace and spent the next 8 days traveling over the majority of the continental United States. And while we do not know yet what kind of information the Chinese surveillance balloon was able to collect, we can be certain that the CCP's intention was to exploit sensitive sites, including military sites and critical infrastructure across our country. This Chinese surveillance balloon was a brazen display of espionage in the U.S. homeland, but it's ultimately one of the many ways that the CCP is working to exploit our vulnerabilities. Today, we must take the conversation beyond that balloon and discuss all avenues the CCP is threatening U.S. homeland security in. Through the CCP's aggressive national strategy of military-civil fusion, which aims to establish the People's Liberation Army as the dominant global military force by 2049, the Chinese government is stealing information from U.S. military and civilian targets. A majority of the threats China poses to the U.S. homeland security are occurring below the threshold of traditional conflict. We need to be cognizant of these threats and generate multifaceted solutions to deter them. These threats are already directly affecting American citizens. MD Anderson Cancer Center, for instance, one of the nation's top hospitals for cancer in my home state of Texas, ousted several scientists from the center in 2019 who had ties to the CCP. The scientists were flagged by the U.S. National Institute of Health regarding a variety of threats, including data security, intellectual property loss, and they were ultimately investigated by the FBI. This incident was by no means unique, with the CCP consistently targeting American research and innovation across the country. Additionally, the CCP is exploiting the open nature of American academia to steal vital research and development. Confucius Institutes, marketed as mechanisms to promote Chinese language and culture, have used the CCP to recruit American talent to support military-civil fusion, monitor Chinese nationals who are studying at American universities, and have faced allegations of visa fraud. In recent years, the U.S. government has worked to close most of these Confucius Institutes. However, the CCP has made efforts to change the institutes' names or obfuscate their influence on American universities. Today, as a matter of fact, I am reintroducing with Chairman Green and Congressman Brad Winstrup the DHS Restrictions on Confucius Institutes and Chinese Entities of Concern Act, which passed out of this committee with bipartisan support last Congress. This bill works to close Confucius Institutes and any other programs with the same goal operating in the U.S. It also holds American universities accountable and ensures they prioritize their students' education and right to free speech above partnerships with Confucius Institutes that require universities to censor curriculums in favor of CCP ideology. I appreciate the support of Chairman Green, Congressman Winstrup, and look forward to a bipartisan discussion on this. In addition to threats to American IP and academic freedom, the CCP is targeting U.S. cybersecurity and critical infrastructure and undermining our economic security. Moreover, illicit fentanyl analogs, and related precursor chemicals are predominantly sourced from the PRC and then sent to Mexico. These poisonous drugs continue to fuel the tragic fentanyl crisis in our homeland. I am eager to discuss these challenges and more during today's hearing. Let me be clear about this hearing. To anyone who's listening at home or abroad, this conflict and the discussion today doesn't have anything to do with the Chinese people who are living in China and being manipulated by the CCP. This conflict is with the CCP. It's an authoritarian regime that commits genocide against its own people. They censor free speech, not just in China, but across the globe, and they aim to end democracy as we know it. This hearing is the first of many, but it's a first step on this subcommittee and the greater Committee on Homeland Security, which we intend to confront the threats stemming from CCP influence that target our homeland. We will meet CCP aggression with strength, its deception with unflinching truth, and its attempts at exploitation with justice. We look forward to a bipartisan cooperation in this Congress as we all seek effective solutions to combat pervasive threats posed by the CCP to our homeland security. I now recognize the ranking member, my friend from Rhode Island, Mr. Magazizer, for his opening statement.
Good morning. I want to thank Chairman Pfluger for calling this important hearing and thank our witnesses for coming today. I especially want to thank Dr. Tyler Jost from Brown University in Rhode Island for joining us, along with our other expert witnesses. It is an honor to serve as ranking member of this subcommittee, and I look forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman, and all members of the subcommittee on a bipartisan basis to protect Americans from those who seek to threaten the security of the homeland. Make no mistake, China is the competitor with the greatest combination of intent and capacity to threaten U.S. global leadership. President Xi himself stated last year that by 2049, he wants to ensure that China and the CCP lead the world in terms of composite national strength and international influence. This is concerning for all of us who believe deeply that democracy and human rights must be advanced and protected here in our own country and across the world. Just last year, FBI Director Christopher Wray sat before this committee in this very room and warned that the greatest long-term threat to our nation's information and intellectual property and our economic vitality is the counterintelligence and economic espionage threat from China. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo has warned that the Chinese Communist Party is accelerating their efforts to fuse economic and technology policies with their military ambitions in ways that are forcing us, compelling us, to defend United States businesses and workers. We have already seen the Chinese Communist Party threaten the safety and privacy of American citizens through economic espionage and theft of U.S. intellectual property, the theft of personal data of American citizens through cyber attacks, the recent use of a spy balloon and other methods of surveillance to illegally gather intelligence on American territory, and the buildup of military capabilities that seek to eclipse the United States and our democratic allies. We must recognize that the threat posed by the CCP and take immediate action to best position the U.S. to confront China's attempts to undermine our national security. Today's hearing is an important opportunity for members of this subcommittee to demonstrate that we are united in a bipartisan effort to defend the privacy and safety of the American people, to protect U.S. industries and supply chains, and enhance national security, all while remembering that one of the most important ways to counter the Chinese Communist Party's ambitions is to build an economy here at home that works for working people, so we can show the world that our American system of democracy and freedom is more effective in lifting people up than the CCP model of autocracy and repression. Democrats are committed to doing this work with our Republican colleagues in a spirit of collaboration. Last year, thanks to the leadership of President Biden, Congress passed the Bipartisan CHIPS Act to invest $280 billion into domestic semiconductor production that will enhance our national security, strengthen U.S. industry, create jobs, reduce inflation, and improve our competitiveness with China. The CIA has recently launched a dedicated China Mission Center, and the State Department has launched a new Office of China Coordination in order to strengthen the U.S. diplomatic, military, and intelligence capabilities in meeting CCP threats. It is my hope that today's hearing will further illuminate the CCP's strategies to undermine our democracy, our economy, and way of life, and how Congress can work together to meet these challenges. As we do this work together, we must remember that the people of China and people of Chinese origin experience oppression and human rights violations at the hands of the authoritarian Chinese Communist Party, and anti-Asian harassment and discrimination is too prevalent globally and here at home. So I also want to be abundantly clear that we do not condone any anti-Chinese or anti-Asian bigotry, and we must condemn any acts of anti-Asian discrimination in the strongest possible terms. Our struggle is not with the Chinese people, but rather with the Chinese Communist Party that is increasingly hostile to democracy and human rights. The CCP wants nothing more than to see Americans become divided and prejudiced, but they will be disappointed. Instead, we will outcompete the CCP by ensuring that America remains a beacon of freedom to the world and by continuing to provide safe harbor to those fleeing oppression and violence. That is how we will strengthen our nation and our economy. I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. I am pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this very important topic. And I ask that our witnesses please rise and raise their right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before the Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you. I'd like to now formally introduce our witnesses. The Honorable William Evanina dedicated his life for 32 years to government service, and in May of 2020, the Senate confirmed him as the very first Director of National Counterintelligence and Security Center. In this position, Mr. Evanina was the head of counterintelligence for the entirety of the U.S. government, and his background in counterintelligence lends itself well today to our specific discussion, which will focus heavily on the ways of CCP espionage efforts and how they impact our homeland, including the theft of U.S. IP, the exploitation of academic research, and much more. Lieutenant General Joseph T. Guastella joins us from Mitchell Institute, also a friend of mine in a former life as a fighter pilot, and he is a senior fellow at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. Lieutenant General Guastella is a command pilot who most recently served as Deputy Chief of Staff of Operations at U.S. Air Force Headquarters. It was his job to oversee air power capabilities, including the Homeland Defense Mission of North American Aerospace Defense, or NORAD, and NORTHCOM. With the foundation of his impressive background, Lieutenant General Guastella will be able to speak to America's evolving homeland security needs as it faces a challenge never seen before by the CCP. And given the recent shocking events, which I think were a wake-up call of the surveillance balloon, we're grateful for your service, General, and for being here today. The Honorable Carrie Bingen joins us from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, where she is the Director of Aerospace Security Project. Prior to this, she served as Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Security. Her strong background in Homeland Security and defense policies will be an exceptional addition as we discuss the growing and changing threat landscape, including threats to American critical infrastructure as it pertains to the U.S. peer competition with China. I'd now like to once again recognize the ranking member, gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Magaziner, for a brief introduction of the next witness.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm pleased to welcome our fourth witness, Dr. Tyler Jost. Dr. Jost is an assistant professor of political science and international and public affairs at Brown University in the great state of Rhode Island. He is also the Watson Institute Assistant Professor of China Studies and devotes his time and effort to improving our understanding of national security decision-making in the People's Republic of China. Professor Jost also previously served as a military intelligence officer with assignments in Afghanistan, U.S. Cyber Command, and the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you to all the witnesses for taking time here. I now recognize the Honorable William Evanina for an opening statement. We do have a timer, and we'll keep them to 5 minutes. You're recognized.
Chairman Pfluger, Ranking Member Magaziner, members of the subcommittee, it's an honor to be here with you today to discuss this really important topic. I spent 32 years of my career working for the U.S. government, in the FBI, the CIA, as the chairman referenced, as the first Senate-confirmed director of the National Counterintelligence and Security Center. But I'm here before you today as the CEO of the Evanina Group, where I provide consulting services to boards of directors, CEOs, and executives on this exact threat we discussed today. Today's topic, China and the threat to the homeland, is an existential threat. It's the most complex, pernicious, aggressive, strategic threat our nation has ever faced. I proffer to this subcommittee that the U.S. private sector and academia have become the geopolitical battle space for China. Xi Jinping has one goal: to be the geopolitical, military, and economic leader of the world, period. Along with the Ministry of State Security, the People's Liberation Army, and the United Front Work Department, they drive a comprehensive whole-of-country approach to their efforts to invest, leverage, infiltrate, influence, and steal from every corner of the United States. This is a generational battle for Xi, and it drives their every decision. We must approach this threat from the Communist Party of China with the same sense of urgency, spending, and strategy we have done for the past 2 decades to combat terrorism. I would offer to this subcommittee that we are in a terrorism event, a slow, methodical, strategic, persistent, and enduring event which requires, in response, a degree of urgency of action. Let me be more specific. The Communist Party of China's capabilities and intent are second to none as an adversary. The cyber breaches, insider threats, surveillance and penetrations into our critical infrastructure, of which 85% is owned by the private sector, have all been widely reported. There's much more in the classified realm, but we've become numb to it as a nation. Additionally, it's estimated that 80% of American adults have had all of their private data stolen by the Communist Party of China. The other 20%, just most of it. Layering in the Communist Party of China's crippling stranglehold on many aspects of our supply chain, and what results is a daunting vulnerability and susceptibility of unacceptable proportions. When we layer in the current threat landscape, the sophisticated surveillance balloons, maritime port surveillance, strategic land purchases by military bases, terrestrial and space-based 5G threats, US-based Chinese police stations, Huawei, and TikTok, the collage begins to paint a very bleak mosaic. From a cybersecurity perspective, China possesses persistent and unending resources to penetrate our systems and exfiltrate our data, or sit dormant and wait or plant malware on critical infrastructure for future hostilities. At the same time, the insider threat epidemic originating from the Communist Party of China has been nothing short of devastating to the US corporate world. Additionally, the Communist Party of China strategically conducts malign influence campaigns at the state and local level with precision. This effort must be exposed and mitigated. So why does it all matter? Economic security is national security. Our economic global supremacy, stability, and long-term vitality is at risk. It's squarely in the crosshairs of Xi Jinping and the communist regime. In 2020, the estimated economic loss from theft of intellectual property and trade secrets just from the Communist Party of China, just from what we know in prosecutions, is between $300 billion and $500 billion per year. That equates to about $4,000 to $6,000 per year for an American family of 4 after taxes. The cost is real. So how do we mitigate these threats? We must create a robust public-private partnership with real intelligence sharing, while at the same time staying true to our core values, morals, and rule of law, which made America the greatest country the world has ever seen. This will take a whole-nation approach. It will take time, and such approach must start with contextual awareness campaigns reaching a broad audience from every level of government to chambers of commerces to university campuses and from the boardrooms to the business schools, because the why matters. U.S. boards of directors and investment leaders must begin to look beyond the next fiscal quarter earnings and begin to think strategically about how their investment decisions and awareness of the long-term threat can impact not only their business model, but the economic and national interest of the United States. In conclusion, I investigated terror attacks after September 11th and led counterintelligence programs for the FBI. I would suggest that the threat posed by China is much more dangerous to the longevity and sustainability of our nation than any terrorist threat actor. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Evanina. And I now recognize General Gostella for his opening statement.
Chairman Pfluger, Ranking Member Magaziner, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. As an individual who spent over 3 decades in service to our nation, I am also deeply concerned about the threats the Chinese Communist Party drives towards the U.S. homeland, especially in the military swim lane. And that's why events like this today are so important. On my last assignment on active duty, I was the Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations for the United States Air Force. Our job was to organize, train, and equip forces, air forces, and then present those forces to the combatant commanders around the world. That includes NORAD Northcom, the command in charge of Homeland Defense. I also developed a very good understanding of the threats that China poses to the United States and the capabilities they use to achieve those objectives. I'd first like to highlight begin describing the threat that China poses to the United States and its allies. So in 1991, when the U.S. was celebrating the end of the Cold War, and we also were celebrating victory in Operation Desert Storm, China went to school on us. They took note, and they started a very concerted and deliberate effort to modernize their military capabilities. And here we are, 3 decades later, and they have largely met that mark. And they even seek further progress. That's why this year they saw even a significant increase in their defense spending. Their military now enjoys leading-edge capabilities that include long-range precision strike, hypersonic weapons, advanced integrated air and defense weapons, stealthy aircraft, surface-to-air missiles, and electronic warfare. And several of those systems have the range to hold the U.S. homeland at risk. And so the Chinese spy balloon, as was mentioned before, which garnered significant attention this past February, is a very loud wake-up call regarding the CCP's global ambition. Unfortunately, the U.S. is stretched thin when it comes to the capabilities and the capacity required to defend our homeland in the air domain, air and space domain. NORAD was originally designed to detect and defend North America from a catastrophic attack from the Soviet Union, later Russia. An additional role was added on after 9/11 to intercept, identify, and redirect unidentified aircraft that are approaching restricted areas. So the NORAD radars were optimized and tuned to detect aircraft that met those criteria. So balloons, until recently, generally did not fit in that category. But as threats evolve, including balloons, stealth aircraft, UASs, unmanned aerial systems, cruise missiles, so must our detection and defense enterprise. This will require that we modernize current radars and install new sensors in emerging zones of vulnerability, not just over the nation, but well outside our sovereign territory so we can get a heads up that they're coming. We must invest resources in the NORAD mission. That command gets its aircraft from the U.S. Air Force, but the Air Force today is the oldest and the smallest it's ever been in history. We're still flying B-52s that are 60 years old, tankers that are over 50 years old, fighters over 30 years old. Even the famed F-22, the best air-to-air fighter ever made, first flew in 1997. The Homeland Defense, however, doesn't start here in the homeland. Homeland Defense starts abroad with the combatant commanders that have the forces that are capable of an offensive punch against our adversary countries that deters them from attacking us. That's where it begins. The Air Force has to be modernized in the numbers necessary to meet the demands of the National Defense Strategy, as well as to deter threats against our homeland. More specifically, consider the Air Force's fighter inventory is too small to meet real-world demands. It's a major security concern, for while other services possess fighters, the Air Force is specifically tasked with homeland security, the air sovereignty mission. The Air National Guard is the entity within the Air Force that bears the preponderance of homeland defense. And their mission is particularly hard hit by the gap between old aircraft that are aging out of the inventory and a lack of new aircraft arriving to backfill those spots on the ramp. So Homeland Defense also requires investment in modernization and command and control, resiliency, ground and space-based sensors, data fusion, air refueling capabilities. Homeland Defense is our highest priority mission. We need to start treating it that way. And one war story, to share with the group here. On January 8th, 2020, 11 Iranian ballistic missiles hit a U.S. base at Al-Assad in Iraq. I was the coalition forces air component commander at that time. We possessed the intelligence about the attack that was going to happen. We were able to detect the missiles at launch. We were able to track the trajectory. But when it came to shooting them down, to defeating the missiles, we lacked any options. Why? Because we did not have the capacity, the defensive capacity, due to the other global commitments that our force was spread across. American service members had to ride out that attack and hope for the best. It was an appalling set of circumstances. Let's think what could happen against our homeland with threats like that. Adversaries like China understand these vulnerabilities. The United States is gradually waking up to this reality, but leaders have yet to seriously address the shortfall. We're still in a problem-admiring phase, not in a solution implementation phase. That has to change. So we have the bravest men and women in uniform, but we owe it to them to ensure they're prepared for the mission we ask them to execute. We owe it to our American citizens to ensure they're protected from attack. America's homeland is no longer a sanctuary against threats like China. We must recognize this new reality and aggressively close critical gaps in capacity and capability in the air domain. Thank you for allowing us to focus on this topic today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for your opening statement. I now recognize Ms. Bingen.
Great, thank you. Chairman Pfluger, Ranking Member Magaziner, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for letting me appear before you today. I've been fortunate to examine these issues from my time at a technology startup, time at the Department of Defense, and then here legislatively as a staffer on the House Armed Services Committee. Let me start by saying conflict with China is not inevitable, not inevitable. However, the Chinese Communist Party has ambitions to become the world's leading power and has undertaken a broad campaign using all tools of national power and influence to achieve its aims. While strategic competition and potential military conflict with China may seem abstract to many Americans, the Chinese surveillance balloon was a tangible, visible sign that the U.S. homeland is not out of reach of Beijing's threats. The PRC challenge is one of both national and economic security. It is not only the pacing military threat for the United States, but also the top threat to U.S. technology competitiveness. I'll discuss 3 areas where the CCP threat to the U.S. homeland is particularly acute: technology acquisition, critical infrastructure, and influence operations. And then I'll offer a few recommendations to help address these challenges. First, technology acquisition. Beijing has made it a national goal to acquire foreign technologies to advance its economy and modernize its military. It continues to use both legal and illegal methods to target U.S. technologies, including in areas such as high-performance computing, biopharmaceuticals, robotics, energy, and aerospace. And it targets the people, information, businesses, and research institutions in the United States that underpin them. These methods include economic espionage, cyber data exfiltration, joint ventures, research partnerships, and talent recruitment programs, among others. My written testimony offers several specific examples of where the CCP has put these methods into practice. This matters for our defense, as our military's battlefield advantage has long rested on our superior technology. However, that is at risk as Beijing seeks to close the gap in our technology advantage. This matters for American businesses, as Mr. Evanina said, where $225 to $600 billion is the annual estimated cost to the U.S. economy from stolen intellectual property. CCP law and policy further bolsters these methods. For example, its 2017 National Intelligence Law requires organizations and citizens to support intelligence work and to keep it secret. Second, the CCP is targeting critical infrastructure in the United States. I fully anticipate that Beijing would seek to disrupt it, possibly through cyber attacks, especially early in a conflict. This could be motivated by a desire to deter U.S. action, affect U.S. decision-making, delay the mobilization of U.S. forces, or affect the will of the American people. The government has taken some steps to share intelligence information on PRC campaigns to target critical infrastructure, such as oil and gas pipelines. And importantly, it also included sharing tactics and techniques and procedures used by the Chinese. Third, the U.S. homeland is within reach of the PRC's influence activities. Examples include TikTok, that U.S. intelligence officials caution can be influenced by CCP-driven manipulation of its algorithms. They also include Operation Foxhunt, where CCP-directed individuals spy on U.S.-based pro-democracy advocates, intimidate Chinese and Chinese-American students at universities, and pressure individuals in the United States to return to China, including by threatening their family members. The PRC also exerts influence through its Belt and Road Initiative, exporting terrestrial infrastructure, information and communications technologies, and other technology areas. This global influence directly impacts U.S. businesses and U.S. security interests here at home. One acute area of competition is in commercial telecommunications, including satellite broadband communications, like SpaceX's Starlink and Amazon's Project Kuiper, which CSIS recently examined. Further expansion of Chinese telecommunication services could boost Beijing's presence in foreign terrestrial networks, providing the CCP with remote access, enabling it to surveil users, block internet access, and censor information. I offer a few recommendations to help address these challenges. Expanding education and awareness, and this hearing is very important on that regard, to remind the American public that the threat posed by the CCP is not abstract, nor solely a distant military conflict that could take place across the Pacific. The American public and businesses need to understand the security and economic risks posed by the CCP and understand that they are a target. Expand intelligence threat sharing with the private sector, building off CISA's work to date so companies can better understand their vulnerabilities and make risk-informed decisions regarding their protection and resiliency. Transform counterintelligence and security missions, including leveraging technology like artificial intelligence to help identify supply chain vulnerabilities, track foreign agents, and illuminate disinformation. Leverage technology innovation. Maintaining U.S. technology leadership means not just preventing the transfer of technology to the PRC, but also setting the conditions for our innovation sector to stay ahead of the competition. Boosting cooperation with our allies and partners, which is a competitive advantage and source of strength that the CCP does not have. And technology cooperation can be a strong feature of these relationships. And then finally, continuing to invest in a strong defense, including Homeland defense, which is required to deter PRC aggression, build resiliency to attacks, and ensure that we have the trained people, posture, intelligence, weapon systems, and munitions to defend the United States and the American people. Thank you again for your time today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Bingen. The chair now recognizes Dr. Jost for his opening statement.
Chairman Pfluger, Ranking Member Magaziner, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. It is really an honor to be with you. My testimony is given as a scholar of Chinese foreign policy, and I emphasize this for two reasons. First, my role in academia is one of a researcher, not an administrator, and my testimony is not on behalf of or directly or indirectly associated with my employer. Second, as a former intelligence officer in the U.S. military, I'm well aware that some of the most detailed reporting on topics as sensitive as Homeland Security remained classified. And as such, the testimony I'm best positioned to offer pertains to the scholarly conclusions that can be drawn based upon publicly available research. My remarks today will focus on two areas. One, the broader strategic context through which China's overseas intelligence collection and information campaigns should be viewed. And two, what the publicly available research to date can tell us about the scope and effectiveness of those campaigns. The competition between the United States and China represents one of the defining international challenges of this century. But in my view, at the center of this critical problem rests two issues that most divide Washington and Beijing: the future of Taiwan and perceptions that the other side poses an existential threat to the stability of the domestic regime. Thus, while it is important to seriously evaluate the threats to the homeland posed by China, these should not distract attention from the issues that are likely to define the future of the global competition at their root. China's overseas activities that emerge from this contemporary strategic context can be loosely divided into two categories. The first focuses on China's intelligence collection, which is well documented. The recent incident in which a Chinese high-altitude balloon traversed American airspace illustrates in vivid fashion that China is willing to assume risks in order to gather data against American targets. In parallel to intelligence collection, China engages in operations to disseminate information to foreign audiences. To date, the bulk of these activities are aimed at shaping global public opinion. In simplest terms, China presents foreign citizens with information with the hope that it will shape the target's attitudes and perhaps their behavior. These efforts to shape foreign public opinion through party propaganda are real, and their scope is broad. But there are comparatively few studies that apply validated research methods for estimating the causal effect that exposure to such messages have on foreign audiences. In addition, trends in the global public opinion should provide some comfort. If one judges the effectiveness of China's public diplomacy campaign based solely on China's approval rating in foreign countries, the effort has, at least to date, been a failure. Finally, what evidence we do have suggests there are several reasons why these operations might actually prove to be less effective than some of us might fear. By emphasizing gaps in public knowledge, I am not suggesting that we can dismiss potential threats that China poses to the U.S. homeland. The fact that China has demonstrated its intent to engage in both intelligence collection and efforts to shape foreign public opinion, coupled with the competitive nature of the bilateral relationship broadly, is sufficient cause for serious attention. Rather, my hope is that emphasizing what we do and do not yet know can illuminate policy recommendations which are detailed in my written testimony. Allow me to briefly summarize them here. First, the U.S. government should devote resources towards publicly available research that fills in gaps in our knowledge regarding China's activities abroad. Second, the U.S. government should use diplomatic channels to reestablish opportunities for American researchers to better understand the Chinese political system, and do so in ways that they feel protected from potential exploitation and detainment by the Chinese authorities. Third, the U.S. government needs to better disclose its understanding of the threats that China poses to homeland security, and specifically, it needs to provide citizens with more data about the different risks that American citizens assume when they use foreign technologies. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Jost. Members will now be recognized in order of seniority, alternating between Republican and Democrat for 5 minutes of questioning. It's my hope today that we will be able to go through maybe 2 rounds of questioning. The chair now recognizes myself for 5 minutes of questioning. I think what we heard there is just an incredible breadth of knowledge and experience about what the Chinese Communist Party has been doing, for several decades, what they are currently doing, and the threats that, as that wake-up call moment happened several weeks ago with the Chinese surveillance balloon, that it's incumbent upon us to really start uncovering these threats and focusing on them. And quite honestly, from what we've heard from this panel, thank you for all of your opening statements. We could have several hearings on the individual subjects, but appreciate the time here. I'll start with Mr. Evanina. When you look at the ownership of property in the United States, and we go back, PRC-based ownership of U.S. farmland in the last 20 years has jumped from about $81 million in 2010 to $1.9 billion at the end of 2021. And moreover, I think it's widely reported that a lot of the PRC or PRC-linked ownership is adjacent to very sensitive facilities, government facilities, military facilities in the United States. Can you provide insight as to why that is, what the goal is, and what they're doing with those lands?
Thanks for the question, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to try really hard to stay in the unclassified realm here, but it's a comprehensive strategic plan that goes back about a decade to the CCP's plans and intentions, which incorporates multifaceted intelligence apparatus, both the MSS and the PLA. And it starts what I would call and phrase outside the fence line of DoD facilities. That began with the Huawei cell tower capabilities, tracking and being able to monitor not only troop movements, but weapon silos and other areas. The strategic purchases of businesses outside of not only military bases, but military residential areas. The influence of the Chinese being able to do software and malware manipulation penetration on electrical grids and power stations outside of the military bases. I think the next aspect is exactly what you referenced, right? What is the next thing that the Communist Party of China, and Russia for that matter, are looking to exploit outside the fence line of U.S. military bases? That includes land purchases. And I think when you look at all the land that not only the Chinese Communist Party and their proxies have purchased, you're going to find a strategic military base and or subterrestrial things in the ground, as well as energy issues to the military base. And also we look at the balloon we just saw, very similar trajectory to those areas. So it's a comprehensive strategic plan that you see from the Communist Party.
Do you think there was coordination between staying in the unclassified? I mean, the lands that the balloon flew over, purchases that we've seen, I mean, could there be coordination either now or in the future?
Absolutely. There's nothing done by the Communist Party of China that does not have strategic anti-date or coordination. I think we'll see in the future, if it's declassified, what some of the things the balloon was surveilling and or potentially doing more surveillance too.
Thank you. General Costello, thanks for the testimony. And, you know, the threats that you mentioned that you're very worried about and concerned about, what keeps you up at night on the air power threats? And what needs to happen resource-wise, specifically here, NORAD, NORTHCOM, in order to identify, deter, detect, and defeat?
Thank you, Chairman. What keeps me up at night is the age and the capabilities of our existing air and space forces. You know, for 20 years, we've been engaged in a very land-centric campaigns in the Middle East. We've been doing counterinsurgency, counter-violent extremists, counterterrorism, all important for our nation. But during that 20 years, we did not invest in air and space forces to the extent we needed to. So we're left with that old fleet that I described before. You know, a 30-year-old fighter can do fine providing close air support in Iraq or Afghanistan against a low-end threat, but it's not going to survive very well against, and it's not going to survive in the China fight, and what more so, it doesn't deter China. And so we have to realize the investment that's needed in the air and space domain has been neglected, and we have to get after it for the exact reasons that's been described by our expert panelists on China. And that's what keeps me up at night.
When you look at the threats that are being posed, hypersonics, the ranges that are increasing, the ability to reach out and touch us, how important is NORAD, the Joint Air Power Enterprise, to the defense of our homeland?
You know, NORAD, the National Defense Strategy, two of them now in a row have said that Homeland defense is the #1 priority. Problem is, we haven't resourced it to that extent that our words say. And the commanders of NORAD have asked for modernization of radars for years now and had not gotten it. And that would have helped us detect those balloons sooner. And then the aging fighters. You know, almost every major metropolitan city in America is defended by our Air National Guard fighters that are getting older and older. They don't have the capabilities, the radars that they need, not only for the balloons, but the radars they need for the real threat, which would be a cruise missile attack against our homeland. And so that's what concerns me.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back and now recognize the ranking member.
Thank you, Chairman. It is clear that the Chinese Communist Party is taking a whole-of-government approach to advancing its ambitions at the expense of U.S. and democratic interests, and therefore we must take a whole-of-government approach to meeting that threat. So that covers Homeland Security, Defense, Commerce, State Department, et cetera. So I'm going to focus on the Homeland realm. Dr. Joes, can you expand on the methods that the CCP is using to influence public opinion, both here at home in the U.S. and globally, and what more we could be doing to measure their efforts and to mitigate their success?
Sure. Thank you very much for the question. The bulk to date of China's influence operations, both in the United States and abroad, are focused on what you might say are winning friends and influencing people, right? This is coming directly from Xi Jinping, who has directed the party's apparatus that has deep roots in propaganda to leverage those capabilities in order to tell China's story well to the world. It is interesting to think about the ways in which China's institutions domestically are sort of naturally positioned to make that transition from a domestic-based propaganda machine to an international one. If one thinks from the perspective of the Chinese Communist Party, from their perspective, domestic propaganda has worked thus far in keeping the CCP in power. Those capabilities and organizations exist, and it is easy to see how they would assume that those same types of propaganda would work in foreign audiences. To date, however, as I emphasized in my written testimony, we don't necessarily have the best evidence to judge whether or not these propaganda efforts outside of Chinese borders have been effective. As I mentioned in the opening statement, we do know that global public opinion towards China, particularly in the United States and the countries with whom we share closest interests, has declined substantially in the past few years, which would actually suggest that from a certain perspective, the propaganda doesn't necessarily work as well as the CCP would hope. That being said, there's a multitude of things that are confounding that relationship, of course, right? The fact that there's been a global pandemic, the fact that it could be working in certain areas and not others, certain framings that the Chinese Communist Party and its diplomats use are more effective than others. And it's one of the reasons why I think there needs to be more research on this matter and something the U.S. government can certainly help with.
Thank you. Mr. Evanina, in your written testimony on the threat of corporate espionage and the theft of intellectual property, you recommended the creation of an economic threat intelligence agency to assist U.S. companies in protecting themselves against corporate espionage. Can you expand on how that should be structured to be most effective if we were to do it?
Thank you, Ranking Member. I recommended an entity similar to the FSISAC that is specifically geared towards the economic awareness and understanding of IP and trade secret theft and emerging of not only the thought process, but the ideation, but also the laws that govern our patent processes and our IP theft around the world, and to mirror what the Communist Party are doing around the, and then educate our American businesses, their general counsels, the people that do law for them outside counsel, to understand what it looks like when you're about to be stolen and robbed for IP theft, and to be able to provide that real-time actionable intelligence from the intelligence community, DHS, and Commerce and Treasury to businesses who are not only at risk, but in the process, because once it happens, it's too late, the data's already gone. The government needs to be more forward-leaning and left of boom.
Well, thank you. I found that very interesting, and so perhaps as a follow-up after this hearing, you can send us some recommendations in more detail about where it should be housed, how it should be staffed, which agencies should be involved, because I think that's a very interesting recommendation.
Yes, sir.
And I yield back.
All right, the gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. D'Esposito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all. So dozens of demonstrators protested outside of a building in New York City's Chinatown last month. The building, which is owned by the Changli Association, operates what they call a service station. And they're accused of operating a CCP police station that allegedly conducts surveillance and intimidates CCP descendants and activists. Like the recent incident with the Chinese surveillance balloon, this station could be the latest CCP action that violates U.S. sovereignty and poses a threat to national security. It's been reported that there's over 100 of these offices around the world. Mr. Vina, please describe your concerns surrounding this potential CCP police station in terms of counterintelligence threats and the safety of Americans.
Thank you, Congressman. I think when you look at that specific issue in New York City and the subsequent search by the Department of Justice and FBI, which is a high threshold to obtain, it's a manifestation of the strategic plan of the Communist Party of China to not only influence, manipulate their own diaspora here in the United States, but provide an intimidation factor. And I would say that this issue in New York and the search of that domestic police station is in partnership with their Operation Fox Hunt that my colleague, Ms. Bacon, talked about, which is an international program, but very, very aggressive in the United States to surveil and try to rendition Chinese diaspora here who are anti-Xi and regime, and they've been very successful at it. And the fact that this happens on our American soil, to me, is unacceptable.
I agree. So it's been reported that there's over 100 throughout the world. Do we know how many are actually on U.S. soil?
I do not, but I'm pretty confident our law enforcement, both at the state, local, and federal level, are pretty aware of that.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize my good friend, the gentleman from California, Mr. Correa.
Mr. Chairman from Texas, thank you very much. I've been sitting in this committee for a number of years. Cyber, big issue, continues to be a big issue. A number of testimonies ago, we heard that Russians have essentially penetrated most of our infrastructure, just like we've penetrated most of their infrastructure. So we have a standoff, so to speak. Action by either side is too expensive, so to speak, in terms of the damage. now we have a situation internationally, a geopolitical realignment where Russia and China are beginning to work much more collaboratively. My question, common thought, first of all, Mr. Ivania, how do you see this, given that our foreign minister, China's foreign minister recently said, essentially warned us of conflict and confrontation in the United States? How do you see this evolution in terms of multiplier effect of a threat on the United States? Russia and China working together, how real is that? And what's the potential for the future of continued collaboration to really challenge the United States in ways we have not envisioned in the past? Thank you.
Mr. Congressman, I concur with your statement, and I think it is a very concerning issue when two nation states who don't like each other are merging against one common enemy, the United States. Geopolitically, diplomatically...
You're saying that enemy of an enemy is my friend? Is that the situation?
I was going to say
you've
that,
got?
but it was a little bit it's better you said it. But yes, correct. And I think when you look at, I'll stick in my lane here, from, you mentioned the Russians' penetration to our systems, both IT and OT, SCADA, ICS systems here in the United States, probably predates the Communist Party of China, but I'm pretty confident the Communist Party of China has either duplicated those penetrations or ridden along those. And I think the sharing of the intelligence services between Vladimir Putin and Russia and the Communist Party is probably the most problematic for me as what they see, because that's the most invisible part of that threat.
I think that right now we still have an edge when it comes to cyber, 2 or 3 years maybe. So I often think of defense, a good offense is the best defense you can have. So if I may, what would you recommend moving forward would be the best way to counter these unprecedented challenges that our country has?
Congressman, I think you make a good point, and it's probably important that we reiterate the fact that as much as what you're hearing here is depressing, demoralizing, and it's a legitimate threat to our nation, we must pause and remember that we have the most amazing military and intelligence and law enforcement capabilities the world has ever seen. The women and men of DOD and the intelligence community are phenomenal. Our capabilities are second to none in cyber, military apparatus, and intelligence. So Americans should go to sleep at night, be thankful for the fact that offensively, we've never seen anything better than we can do. Unfortunately, it's not public.
Today.
Yes, sir.
Please continue. Didn't mean to interrupt you. Anybody else have comments, thoughts on my questions? Ma'am?
Congressman, if I might build off of that on cyber, when I look at the Homeland, so much of our commerce and activity rides on commercial infrastructure. And building off of Mr. Evanina's point earlier, it's very important that the government figure out how to share threat intelligence information with the private sector, with those oil, gas, pipeline, energy, financial services sectors.
In real time.
In real time, and that's the key. And if you're a business, you hear this top-level talk, but what's particularly valuable is figuring out a way to provide security read-ins to some of these business leaders, bring them into the tent, but also share specific tactic, techniques, procedures with them. It's one thing to hear about this general Chinese threat, it's another thing to hear the tactics that they're using to go after you, and then you realize, holy crap, that's what's been happening in my network. Now, let me work with you to take some preventative measures.
30 seconds, anybody else? The chair, I yield. Thank you very much. Oh, please.
Just amplifying Ms. Begum, I would point to your question, sir, to the incredible success our intelligence and defense department has had with Ukraine and preventing Russian cyber capabilities, not only in Ukraine and Europe and here in the U.S., as a category for us being ahead of others in the cyberspace.
Thank you for ending on a good, positive note. Mr. Chair, I yield.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, former Navy SEAL, Mr. Crane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Thank you, guys, for attending today. We appreciate it. You know, it's not often up here that, me and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle can agree upon something. So it is great to be in agreement on the threat that China is. Obviously, the American people are watching, and they're very concerned when they see spy balloons flying over the United States, farmland being bought up near, farms, fentanyl coming across our southern border. We know, where the origin of a lot of that comes from, theft of intellectual property, covering up the origins of COVID, Chinese police stations in some of our cities. My first question is for you, Mr. Evanina. Did I pronounce that correctly? Sir, do you know what elite capture is?
Yes, sir.
Can you, for the panel and for maybe some of those watching, can you describe what elite capture is, please?
Congressman, I can. I would probably prefer to some of the more better informed experts here on that panel for that particular definition.
Okay. Is there anybody want to take a stab at it? Sir, am I correct that you are an expert in counterintelligence, right?
Yes, sir.
So can you just give me a really broad, doesn't have to be super specific, what is elite capture?
Yeah, I think when you look at it, the capabilities and intent of our adversaries and our ability to be proactive and make an affirmative effort to capture telecommunications to humans, to technology in or at the battlefield or in the gray space provides us the best venue or avenue for potential to win.
Okay. Can you give me some examples of how that's often done? How that's carried out?
Sure. Well, first of all, I would say a lot of it's done with authorities that are granted to both NSA and the FBI overseas. Section 702, our abilities to capture telecommunications conversations to foreign adversaries, both the foreign born, but are also overseas. That gives us leads and intentions of nefarious activities, both terrorism and counterintelligence, espionage, of those actors overseas that are, as Ms. Bingham said, riding on commercial capabilities that are around the world. And that capability allows the U.S. to be able to pre-identify and do threat and warning to actors here in the U.S., both from a systems, data, and people perspective.
Would you say that it's accurate that foreign states and actors often try and compromise and corrupt leaders and officials within our own government? Would you say that that's a form of elite capture?
I would, and it's done quite regularly for decades.
Would you say that it's often true that family members are often used in these types of efforts to corrupt foreign leaders, officials?
Congressman, for the past decade, I've spent my time in 3 different organizations advising and informing Americans, members of Congress, about the threat to them as a person, and it always starts with family members and utilization of mobile telephones.
Thank you. Sir, are you also aware of some of the reported business dealings of Hunter Biden with individuals linked to the Chinese Communist Party?
Only what I've seen in public reporting, sir.
What did you think of the reporting that you read, sir?
I'm not sure I could actually opine of what I've read in public reporting, but I could say that the TTPs of which foreign entities are utilized against Americans and family members is tried and true and very predictable and reportable.
Let me ask you a follow-on to that, sir. Did you find the reports, whether you believe them or not, did you find those reports concerning? Just with all of your knowledge in this space and how you've seen this type of thing play out in the past?
Yes, sir. I think when you look at what's been reported publicly about the potential tactics and techniques that were displayed publicly about the potential for penetration to a family member of the United States president is something that most intelligence services try to do regularly.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. We'll now proceed to a second round of questions, and if we have other members that had previous commitments that show up, then we'll yield that initial question to them. The chair now recognizes myself for an additional round of 5 minutes of questions. Ms. Bingham, thank you for your your expertise and your testimony today. I'd like to focus on that critical infrastructure piece and on what you said, that the CCP is targeting critical infrastructure and that you fully anticipate that should a crisis, hopefully one does not happen, but should one happen and unfold, that Beijing would seek to disrupt the operations of critical infrastructure. And then I was very intrigued by your discussion on sharing information with local, state partners, law enforcement, and otherwise. From the colonial incident to now, have we, as a federal government, and specifically within the Department of Homeland Security, can you give us your opinion of how we are sharing information, if that is effective, and if our critical infrastructure private partners, because most of that is owned by private industry, are they ready for what's next should that colonial incident happen again?
Chairman, thank you for that question. And I think the colonial incident, though not attributable to China, as the government has come out and said, highlights the catastrophic impacts that can occur as a result of a potential attack against cyber infrastructure or cyber critical infrastructure. Your point is exactly right. From everything that I've seen previously, I would anticipate that as a crisis or conflict builds, that the CCP would seek to target critical infrastructure early on. There's a first mover advantage here, I would say, in terms of the kind of the tools that they would seek to use to delay or to deter us or to potentially delay us. On the point of information sharing, I think the success that I would point to is summer of 2021. I thought CISA did a very good job bringing in oil and gas operators and providing very specific detail on the Chinese or the CCP cyber intrusion campaign, what specifically they were targeting, but equally important, how they were doing it, so the tactics, techniques, and procedures. But that's one sector, and there are several different critical infrastructure sectors, and I think there's some very good intelligence information that the community has that they could provide, whether it be to financial services, the electrical grids, et cetera.
Thank you very much. I'll turn to General Costello. What's the impact of 8 days transit of a balloon, a surveillance balloon? When we look at the fact that it transited and then got to the Atlantic Ocean before it was eventually shot down. What kind of message is that sending? What's the impact strategically?
It's a significant wake-up call, like we discussed before, that an air vehicle could traverse American airspace for that long and be afforded the opportunity to collect that much information. A balloon is up there around 12 miles up. Satellites are 350 miles, so it's down in close, or it hangs out for a long time. The potential for collection is significant. And so ideally, the thing would have been taken down prior to hitting U.S. airspace. But like I said, they exploited a seam. I don't think that'll happen again, but you have to talk to government officials about it. But we don't know until we fully exploit what was flown over, what they could have gotten or what they got. But to me, it's a very grave violation of our sovereignty.
Does something like that embolden the CCP and reduce our deterrence, and then what do we have to do to claw that back if it does?
Absolutely. Anytime an authoritarian regime does something of that nature and we don't do anything about it, they'll think, what can I get away with next? And so we have to close this gap. We also have to demonstrate credible capability that we can affect them in some way of our choosing. I think that's important for us, not only have the capability, but the will to do so. That's how you deal with a regime of that nature.
Mr. Evanina, let's turn to the precursors that China produces that are then used in the production of fentanyl, and the connection between the cartels that are taking these products that they're making fentanyl and then eventually getting it into the United States. And can you kind of talk to your opinion as a former intelligence expert on that flow, what the CCP and the cartels are doing to work together, collude, and produce a very deadly substance?
Mr. Chairman, this is a very important topic, not only for this conversation, but for our nation. I think the recent reporting is that over 100,000 people have died in the last year, or 12, 15 months, from a fentanyl overdose. That's multiple times of what happened on 9/11, right? So for our nation to not look at fentanyl as a national epidemic that stems from a nation-state threat actor is probably unacceptable, and we have to be more vigilant in what we do. We can map the production of the precursors from China to Mexico, to the drug gangs, to the American soil. It's a clear, and I know our intelligence and military apparatus are working hard to disrupt that, but it takes more than that to disrupt. There has to be a preemptive effort to put China on notice that this process of killing Americans must stop, and we have to look at it as a terrorism event.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. The chair yields back and now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Magaziner.
Thank you very much. Dr. Jost, in your testimony, you wrote that while the evidence shows that Chinese propaganda efforts in the United States and in other aligned countries do not show evidence of much success yet, we do not have as much data in the global south, in the emerging markets. And we know that China is making big investments in many of these emerging countries for strategic reasons. I think that's very important for our work here in Congress because there's always a perennial debate on the level of foreign aid that we provide to those same nations. So can you just expand a little bit on why this topic is important and what the tie is to the homeland security of the United States?
Thank you, sir. So when one thinks about how propaganda works, we have to think about why a target audience would ever believe it. If I were to come in here and read a bit of Chinese Communist propaganda, obviously would not, but if I were, folks in this room would discount that bit of information pretty significantly. And the reason is that they know it's propaganda. So the effectiveness of such an information or influence campaign rests upon the ability of targets to be able to understand that what political scientists would call the cue giver, the actor who is giving the information, doesn't have their best interests at heart. So that's component number one. And component number two is some baseline level of distrust of that target state. So what we don't know, I think, is in countries outside of the United States and countries that the United States shares very close relationships with, is that baseline level of mistrust that is present in most of the US public, present in those other countries, which would then cause the targets in those countries to discount the cue or discount the bit of propaganda.
Yeah, thank you. And I think especially when we look at things like access to rare earth minerals that are critical to our economy and other factors, those relationships with the global south are important. China certainly understands that, and we must understand it as well. Question for Dr. Joseph or anyone. Chairman Pfluger and I both in our opening statements were clear that our adversary here is not the Chinese people. It is an authoritarian and anti-democratic regime that is becoming increasingly aggressive. On the topic of anti-Asian hate globally, would you agree, and just Dr. Joseph, but anyone else can weigh in as well, that it is important that we combat anti-Asian hate in all of its forms for a range of reasons, but including the fact that we do not want to give the Chinese Communist Party ammunition to fuel their propaganda, both in China and here at home?
Thank you, Ranking Member. Yes, absolutely. Anti-Asian racism has absolutely no place in American society. I think we can all agree on that. And I think we can also all agree that the reasons why that is unacceptable in the United States are orthogonal to whether or not the Chinese Communist Party is able to exploit it, just as you said. That being said, it is true that Chinese diplomats and the Chinese state do call attention to these trends. So for example, there is an annual report that the Chinese state issues on human rights in the United States, which oftentimes calls out these types of events, both broadly in terms of race and specifically on anti-Asian racial issues.
I would double down and amplify Doctor's statement here, and as I had in my written statement, this is clearly not about the Chinese citizens, both in China or in the United States. This is an issue of Xi and the Communist Party regime and their intelligence services and their strategy. clear. But however, that makes it very difficult. And not only to the doctor's point, I think we have to work very, very clear to say this all the time. This is not about Chinese citizens. But most importantly, the United Front Work Department will use that against us at every single point. So it's a double-edged sword. The more that we don't say it, the more the communist regime and the United Front Work Department will use it against us when we don't say it. Omission is denial that it's real.
And I'll just close by saying I think this is yet another reason why it is important that this committee and this Congress focus on combating the rise of racially motivated extremism here in the homeland as well. And I thank you all very much again for your testimony.
Gentleman yields. Now recognize Mr. Diaz-Bazito.
Thank you, Chairman. In your capacity as the Director of the National Counterintelligence and Security Center, you estimated that the theft of intellectual property by the PRC cost America as much as $500 billion, with a B, a year. Can you just describe the impact this theft has on the everyday American, like people back in my district on Long Island?
Congressman, I think to make this succinct, as I mentioned in my oral remarks, the real impact is about $4,000 to $6,000 per American family after taxes. It's a real cost to an American homeowner, family member.
I'm sorry, can you just say that number again? I apologize.
Between $4,000 and $6,000 per year per American family of four after taxes is what that $500 billion of intellectual property theft equals. And those are known cases. That's not a guesstimate. Secondarily, I'll proffer to the subcommittee, those aren't the real costs. The real costs for all that IP theft, ideation theft, manufacturing theft results in the Communist Party of China building that same capability overseas, getting it to patent in global markets before we do, and then selling it back to the American people, the American public, and corporations. And then multiple CEOs have said to me, Bill, it's not just the dollar value of our product that's been stolen, it's the manufacturing plants that aren't built in the U.S., and it's the tens of thousands of jobs that are not created here in the U.S. because we lost that patent ideation technology to the Communist Party of China, who went to global market first.
And what are some ways that the U.S. government is working to identify counterintelligence issues that threatened American IP?
Well, I think there was a robust agenda, probably starting in 2015 and 16, and I here I'd have to commend the efforts of Senator Burr, Senator Rubio, and Senator Warner on CISI to have what I would call the Chinese roadshows, where we went out around the country and briefed thousands of CEOs of industries about this threat from different sectors, financial services, energy, private equity, venture capital, telecommunications, to make sure that they understood what they were doing has a direct impact on national interests and national security. I think that members of Congress, both in the House and Senate, should have a robust capability to go back to the home districts and document these threats to the chambers of commerce of where you live, and to economic development corporations and to small businesses, so they could identify this nefarious capability early and often to prevent it before it happens.
Thank you, sir, and thank you for your service. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Correa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to focus a little bit on our backyard, south of the border. Had a chance to go to El Salvador a few years ago and learned that China was looking to acquire, purchase 80% of their coast and really build a deep water port in that area. Today, I'm really, really bothered that world's largest oil reserves in Venezuela are essentially in a Venezuelan government of Venezuela, that it has very close ties to Russia and to China. This is our backyard. It's my understanding we still have a good brand south of the border. Most countries, Colombia included and others, still like the brand of America, the American dream, so to speak. Again, thinking about best defense being a good offense, what do we do to make sure that we keep our backyard secure and not have these kinds of advances by other countries?
I'll start, Congressman. I think there's some great answers from the panel as well. I think when we look at South America specifically, we could look, as my colleagues mentioned, subsequent to 9/11, we concentrated on counterterrorism. and we missed the boat of the influence of both Russia and China on South America. And that influence comes with a price because they provide critical infrastructure for free. They provide mobile phones to citizens of South American countries for free. Specifically, the Chinese invest a lot of money in South America to have them beholden to their interests, as well as Russia did historically. I think we probably, and this is getting more in the policy lane, have to be more aggressive and offensive with our brand and our capabilities and our investment in South America to help us in the long run.
We make the best medicines in the world, best COVID vaccine. We're essentially a breadbasket of the world. How can you use those assets to really project our presence in the backyard? Thoughts? Lieutenant General.
Sir, it's a fantastic question, and it's absolutely a concern. Chinese investment in countries around the world, especially when we're absent, allows inroads for them to develop relationships, not just buy what is immediately there, but also leads to future investments and other things. And it comes at a detriment to the U.S. You know, like I said, Homeland defense doesn't start in the homeland. It starts overseas, not only with a credible capability that we need to have, but also with our allies and partners. And so if we become isolationists, if we cede that terrain to the Chinese, we're going to pay a price militarily. And when Chinese military comes into countries, it allows them to start to train with the Chinese, develop a relationship with Chinese, and it results in an inability for us to leverage them the way we should. And so it's a very significant thing for us, and we need to look at that. One last point, and that's on arms sales. A lot of times we don't sell things to countries because we have issues with the country, which is understandable, but sometimes they're going to buy it anyway. And when that happens, it's the choice between them buying Chinese or buying American. Sometimes we need to think, hey, maybe it's worth it, should buy American.
General, I'm going to challenge you here. Did you use the word absence or absence? Did you say that?
So I may have absence or
Well,
less.
are you
less
saying
of
we're
a
not doing our
presence.
job of here, going overseas, visiting people, being diplomats as members of Congress? Do we need to do more of that?
Sir, I think you're doing a great job.
No, that's not the answer I'm looking for, sir. You just said something, and I want to make sure all of our
No, I do, sir.
members of Congress understand exactly. That's a great point. And I want you to back it because we do need to show our faces around the world. We need to do that. General, I want to thank you for that comment.
You're absolutely right. We do need to show our faces around the world. Our military does a lot of international engagement, in mill to mill. We need that same engagement at other levels of government. Our state does that, but getting out and seeing and understanding from those allied and partner perspectives, you know, the one big advantage the U.S. has militarily is that we have a lot of friends out there, that China doesn't enjoy that same thing. We're going to lose those friends if we don't get out there and engage, because those friends allow us to base from their countries, they'll support us, they'll back us up in international forums, and it happens if we engage them.
Thank you, sir. Chairman, I yield.
Gentleman yields. We'll now recognize my good friend and national security expert, somebody who spent 20-plus years in the U.S. Navy, Mr. Gonzalez from Texas.
Thank you, Chairman. And I want to associate my comments with my good friend Lou Carrera. Him and I took a trip to Central America. We went to Guatemala, we went to Honduras, and we went to El Salvador. And one of the I guess, surprising things is that I wasn't aware of is no members of Congress had visited that area in 3 years. So to the point, yes, there's a military aspect of it, but there's also a diplomatic. We'd like to see the State Department do more, but up here in Congress, in a bipartisan manner, we need to be doing more in our own backyard. And I know many of us on this committee are committed to doing this, to doing just that. My first question is for you, General. I just got back from a trip from Taiwan. It's the second trip to Taiwan in the past 14 months. I spent 20 years in the military, as my good friend August Pfluger pointed out, our chairman pointed out. I know what war looks like. We're at war. I mean, this is a war. It may be a Cold War, but this is a war with China. With the People's Republic of China, every single day are invading Taiwan via their cyberspace. Not only that, but the question I have for you is, in particular, your expertise is in air. I spent 5 years as an air crewman flying against China. I know exactly when they come out and they intercept our aircrafts. They're doing that every single day. And there's a danger in that, right? Because everything is fine until there is an accident, a spark, if you will, that turns a Cold War into a hot war. Can you speak just to some of the dangers in which playing this game of chicken brings up, in particular to Taiwan?
Absolutely. China has demonstrated significant aggression in the air by penetrating Taiwanese airspace. And it is a violation of Taiwan's sovereignty. And also, when they're in the air, their professionalism is non-existent. They will, quote, dust us off, if you will. In one case, we had a collision, mid-air collision from one of their aircraft in a Navy P-3. And that is the nature of how they do business. And so what we can't do is watch them and let them get away with behavior like that and not do something back, and not be there with Taiwan, not be present, not be out there and make them respect us the way they are driving fear into the Taiwanese with their aggression.
Thank you for that. And my next question is for you, Ms. Bingen, is turning over to cyberspace. This is what war looks like. That's the first aspect of it. And in cyberspace, there are no boundaries. There are no borders. We're all in on this together. And you can't go it alone. You need to have allies. I put together a bill, the U.S.-Taiwan Advanced Research Act, that essentially creates a closer relationship in the cyberspace with our allies. Can you just speak to that as far as how can the United States grow our relationships with others that, let's say, are not traditional relationships? You know, yes, we have our Five Eyes and we've got those relationships that have had for a long time, but other places like Taiwan, what are your thoughts on growing that in particular in the cyberspace?
Well, Congressman, first, if I can go back to your Taiwan point, and thank you very much for visiting. I had the chance to go there in January as well. And on Taiwan, if I can say, the arming is incredibly important, giving them a greater defensive capability. It includes not just the tangible weapon systems, but the training that goes along with it. And I think there's much more capacity there for increased training opportunities with our forces. And the other point that you raised on Taiwan is every day they are in this cognitive disinformation war with China, and so that the more that with the CCP, so that the more that we can do to help them and highlight or create transparency around those disinformation campaigns is important. On the cyber front, you're absolutely right on the allies. These are areas, and this ties back into China's Belt Road Initiative. They are doing a lot to try to get their infrastructure and make others more dependent on them. Where that leads to is other country, not only their ability to surveil and steal data, but also they're advancing their techno-authoritarian norms and standards. So I think that there are things we can do on the international front, threat sharing, but also building norms much more akin to how we see the world and how we want the internet to be operated, data to be protected, than the Chinese model.
I think it's very clear to point out that the People's Republic of China are the aggressor. I spent 5 years in Iraq and Afghanistan. Chairman Pfluger has also been at war. I think it's safe to say we don't want war. We want to prevent a war. And part of that is showing that we're going to stand firm with our allies to prevent those. And thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Titus.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Before I ask my specific question, I'd like to say that I agree, too, with Mr. Carrera, and it also was brought up by our last speaker that we need to do more. We don't do more by cutting the small foreign aid budget that we have in place now. We do more by investing more. You mentioned Belt and Road. China's investing all across Africa. They're building ports in Lima. They just bailed out Sri Lanka. That's what we're up against. And if we walk away, that's not going to be helpful in these difficult areas. But I want to ask you the question. We just heard this week about China saying that there's a potential conflict or confrontation if we don't put on the brakes. Now, I wonder just what that means for us. Is it an existential threat? Is it saber rattling? Is it nuclear war? What does that mean? Should we be gauging that? And what should we be doing in response besides shoring up Taiwan or, trying to make these investments that seem to be fairly difficult to get people to support? Anybody? Yeah.
Congresswoman, I'll start. I would say the narrative to the recent statement by the Chinese minister is a false narrative that we need to put on the brakes. We should start asking them to minimize their aggression, right? Not only here in the U.S., but with our allies and friends around the world. I think they're really great at putting us in the bucket as being the aggressors. And as we've heard from our distinguished congressmen and congresswomen, that's not the case, right? And I think we as the United States, diplomatically, have to do a better job, a more effective job of making sure the world knows that they are the aggressors. Because I think their narrative, and they have a great propaganda program, as we heard, and they will use that to show us as the aggressors.
General, would you how would you compare the threat by China to the threat internally, our homeland threat by domestic terrorists compared to China, if we're looking at where our priorities should be?
Well, ma'am, the threat to the United States from China is the most grave threat we have faced in our lifetime, certainly since the Cold War. And the reason why is we have an economic superpower that's stealing our technology, that's leaping ahead on weapons that can strike us right here in the homeland, or deny our objectives overseas in defense of Taiwan. And if we let them continue at this pace and we don't answer that, we will find ourselves in a very uncomfortable position as Americans, which is watching U.S. service members lose fights. And so, to me, the existential threat posed by China and the CCP is absolutely the largest threat to the U.S., and we have to realize it. And they're approaching us any seam they can find, any way in. The balloon was a seam that they exploited. There's 100 other seams that's been discussed here. I think it's time that we wake up. It's a Sputnik moment for us here, and I think we need to realize that as an American society.
Just continuing with this down the panel, how about the CHIPS Act? We often hear that China's not the enemy, they're the competitor. Has this helped in any way to deal with the problem that we're now making chips at home instead of being so dependent on them economically?
One aspect on the CHIPS Act that I'd like to highlight is really the national security piece to it. When we look at, was it 80+% of the world's chips, including everything that we use from commercial to our weapon systems, are manufactured within the first island chain. And we've talked also here about the military threat. We and the Taiwan Semiconductor Facility, we need to look at building greater resiliency in our industrial bases and our manufacturing capacities. And so that, for me, was a big benefit of the CHIPS Act.
Would you like to add to this conversation?
Sure. Thank you, Congresswoman. To go back to your original question about the pathways by which we would be most likely to see Chinese aggression, it is my view that the most likely avenue would be over a Taiwan scenario. If one thinks about how to deter that, there are two primary things in place that the United States has in our strategy. The first is a credible reassurance to Beijing that the status quo will not change, because if Beijing thinks that it is backed into a corner and has to choose either losing Taiwan or launching a very risky and even low probability win war, it's quite possible one can imagine them choosing the latter. So that credible reassurance portion is important. The other portion of deterrence, which relates to the CHIPS Act, is the change in the balance of power. So another way in which deterrence could fail is if over time shifts towards Beijing's favor in the probability that they would win a conflict would prompt them to act, even though the cost of the risk would be high. And that's why it's so important to ensure that the U.S. defense industrial base, through things like the CHIPS Act, is closely protected.
I can't see a clock. Is my time up? I can't. Oh, that's well. Just real quickly, is there anything specific we need to do next, like building off of the CHIPS Act, other than going on CODELs to Central America?
Congressman, if I may, just amplify the great comments here. I think on the CHIPS and Science Act, two things need to occur. More of that type of legislation that really partners our U.S. government legislative body funding with the U.S. corporate sector. Two, but the CHIPS and Science Act must be protected now. From ideation to development of new technologies, if we don't protect it, you're going to be having hearings in 5 years saying, how did all the technology from CHIPS and Science Act get stolen and in the hands of the Chinese? So two things can be true.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady's time has expired, and the chair now recognizes for the final question, Mr. Crane.
General, this question is for you. A second ago, you were talking about how you were concerned about the age of the fleet. Is that correct? And then also you were talking about how China continues to steal our intellectual property. Is that correct as well? How do we stop that, General?
Well, the theft of intellectual property is something that probably goes beyond what I can comment on, but step one is realizing that it's happening and ensuring not only the prime contractors, but the subcontractors that develop our defense systems have the appropriate resiliency and hardening. The best way for us to counter China is to invest, the investments the Department of Defense has made for the last 20 years to fight the wars we've been in are not necessarily the investments that are going to make us successful against dealing with a peer competitor like China. And so it's important that we transform our investment to the areas that most concerns them, which is our ability to hold targets at risk in their homeland and our ability to deny them their objectives vis-a-vis Taiwan. And so we can deter them through punishment, and we can also deter them through denial. And that happens by investment in the department in the domains that are most critical facing a peer competitor, air and space.
Thank you, General. My next question is for Mr. Evanina. A moment ago, you were raving about the capabilities and dominance of the U.S. intelligence agency. I think that, probably everybody up here would agree how impressive our intelligence agencies are and have been over the years. My question for you, sir, is are you aware of the lack of trust in our intelligence agencies by U.S. citizens?
Congressman, yes, I am, and it's a concerning issue.
Yeah. And you're aware that there is a select committee on the weaponization of the federal government up here right now?
Yes, sir, I'm aware of that.
I represent some amazing people in Arizona, rural Arizona. They love this country, one of the most patriotic districts in Arizona. I myself am a Navy SEAL. I joined the Navy after 9/11, and I served for 13 years, and I love this country. And I want our intelligence agencies to be strong. I think they need to be strong for good reason. But I'm going to tell you right now, sir, when we read years after the fact that 50 former national intelligence folks, several heads of the CIA claimed that the Hunter Biden laptop is Russian disinformation, only to find out years later what we all knew that it wasn't, that's alarming to a lot of Americans. And it makes us lose trust in our intelligence agencies. And for me, when I look at a guy like you that's done everything that you've done, as intelligent as you are, I know that's got to piss you off. If there were 50 former Navy SEALs out there lying to the American people, and I found out about it, that would piss me off because it undermines the community that I hold so dear. And I'm sure you probably have a very similar endearment to your community. Am I correct in assuming that?
You're correct, sir.
What do you think we do about that, sir? How do you think we regain the trust with the American people and our intelligence agency?
Congressman, I think you bring up a very valid point that not only reaches the current events of today with our intelligence and law enforcement community, but it also impacts the recruiting of future generations of women and men who want to serve in the U.S. government, intelligence, and military apparatus. And I think that is the core element. I think two things have to happen. Number one, there has to be complete transparency of things that happened in the past, but more importantly, of the great things that women and men are doing. We have to be more proactive in getting out to your district and other districts at the local level. And secondarily, there has to be some transparency of what's real and what's not real with the narrative reporting that we see in the media. And I think that's the obligation of law enforcement intelligence agencies to be forthwith of declassification and transparency of what's going on.
Real quick, Mr. Evanina, if it seemed like I was coming after you today, I apologize for that. It's nothing personal at all. I love this country, And I'm tired of losing faith and trust in the institutions and the organizations that as a little kid I had aspired to and I upheld. And I know I'm speaking for a lot of Americans when I say that, brother, okay? Last question I have real quick is for Ms. Bingen. You said that war with China was not certain. Can you expound on that a little bit? And please tell us all how we can, in your opinion, how we can avoid war with China. Thank you.
Absolutely, Congressman. I want to say that the cause isn't lost, and there are things that we as a nation can proactively do. So, for example, continuing to invest in a strong defense, ensuring our forces are ready, is a signal and a deterrent. Making sure that we invest in resilient networks, so that if the CCP decides to launch an attack, it will have a less effect on our networks and our infrastructure. Superior technology. Former Secretary of Defense I worked for would always say, we never want to send our sons and daughters into a fair fight. With the technology theft happening, we are very much at risk of sending our sons and daughters into a fair fight. So superior technology and agility in terms of how we use that technology. And then ensuring that we have a network of allies and partners. This is a weakness that the CCP has that we have. And sir, with all of your service, you know that we fight in coalitions, and it's important to make sure that our allies are with us and partners are with us, and not with China.
Thank you. I yield back.
All right, so we have some logistical changes here. The chairman had to step out, so I'm going to ask unanimous consent for Ms. Jackson Lee to be recognized for 5 minutes.
We're in trouble now.
We're both freshmen, so
Yeah.
bear with us.
All right.
Unanimous consent for Ms. Jackson Lee to be
I recognize Ms. Jackson Lee.
Well, to both of the chairman and the ranking member, I'm very pleased to be able to join you, and from my perspective, you're two distinguished members of Congress, and thank you for your service. Thank you for your military service. Before I start, I think because we're in Homeland Security, allow me just to put on the record that to be able to compete with China, I think it is extremely important that we assert democratic values, the strength of our values, our competitiveness, and maybe we will have an opportunity to get the answer to why, I believe it's public now, all of the personal data of so many Washingtonians, members of Congress, House and Senate, have been breached. I don't believe that we have had any determination of who breached it, but we certainly want to be on top of those elements, be they commercial or be they a foreign country, from exposing private data of members of the House and Senate who have the responsibility of governing this nation. I wanted to put that on the committee's record because I'm incensed about it and hope that we will have some involvement ultimately in assessing that situation. But this is a very important hearing, and I want to begin by raising this question, and I'll have a second question, and I think, gentlemen, I will be finished. But I want to raise a question. Dr. Jose, you have described the evolution of the Chinese Communist Party's thinking when it comes to China's role around the world. We know that in recent years, the CCP has set its aims at developing China-centered and controlled global infrastructure, transportation, trade, and production networks. They tolerate no diversity when they go into countries. It is China, China, China. They don't even use the indigenous people. And China is competing with the United States in a global competition over government values. We have to win the world over by saying that our values of trade and otherwise are much better than theirs. And so how successful are China's efforts? What actions can the federal government take to outcompete the Chinese Communist Party? Frankly, I think we're nicer, but I also think that if you interact with us, you'll have the benefits of investment in your own country, and you'll have the benefits of long-term recovery. Many of you know that we passed the CHIPS Act, Chips and Science Act, close to my heart as a former member of the Science Committee, which invests $280 billion to increase domestic semiconductor production. I'm excited about that. Some of that may even come to Texas. Unfortunately, not these gentlemen here, I don't think, that 90% of our friends on the other side of the aisle did not vote for it, but I know that they're probably working with it in their districts. So Dr. Jose, would you share that with me? And I'd love to have Ms. Bingham to answer that question as well. Dr. Jose, would you please? And
Thank you, Congresswoman.
looking at my...
These are really excellent questions, and I thank you for them. So you raised the issue of difference in government values, and I agree, although I should note that we do have some common interests, if not common values. China and the United States both want to see their populations live prosperous lives, for example, and both sides want to see the world address some of the challenges of global climate change. That being said, it is very true that the two countries have stark differences in the way they see the relationship between state and society. The protections that we have in the United States by which citizens enjoy civil liberties and can organize against the state in order to keep its power in check are simply not present there. And it is true that China indiscriminately or without considering the types of behaviors that the target regime or the target state is conducting, will invest in it. And you mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative. This is certainly one of the keystone portions of China's efforts. I do agree that the nature of the regime in that target country is quite important. We do have some research that suggests that economic statecraft that China uses, for example, is less effective when the target country is democratic. There's an intuitive logic there, of course, because if individuals, just like in the United States, can mobilize against their government if they are in collusion with the Chinese Communist Party for illicit gain, they can hold them accountable. And so I think that is it's a mechanism by which we can indirectly shape China's ability to use the Belt and Road in the way that you're describing.
Ms. Bingham?
Congressman, if I can add, you mentioned it exactly right. China has a playbook that they're using with the Belt and Road. We've seen it, the ports, 5G are examples, the ports where they go into countries, Djibouti is a great example, where they go in, they operate the commercial port, they kick out the locals, they build up military infrastructure, and then it's a greater threat to the region and to our national security interests. So we see that happening across the globe. We as a government, I say formally, but the government needs to figure out how do they bring all their different tools of national power to the table to provide alternatives. Some of the areas we've been talking about today are on the technology front. I have a space background. I would offer as an example, our commercial space innovation sector right now is phenomenal. We are using our space technologies, our data in ways well beyond national security. Understanding the climate, mapping, countering illegal fishing. This is soft power for Americans and for our companies. So ways that we can leverage some of these newer technologies while clearly protecting and ensuring that they don't fall into the hands of the CCP, but working with our allies and partners across the globe who want to work with us in these areas, figuring out ways to get that kind of information to them and opening up markets for our businesses so they're not just relying on the US government is also important.
Let me thank you all so very much. I think it's been established that the Belt and Road technology or approach is a danger to the framework of democracy of this nation. We need to use that power of our values and, of course, of our technology. I like commercial space just because I'm a NASA aficionado and space exploration is crucial. And Dr. Jose, thank you for that framework that we can utilize. This is an important hearing, and I thank you, gentlemen, for yielding, and I yield back to the chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Jackson-Lee. I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and members for their question today. Also want to thank the members of the subcommittee that may have some additional questions, and we may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we would ask the witnesses to respond to these in writing. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing record will be open for 10 days. Without objection, this subcommittee stands adjourned.